The scratching sounds started the moment Agnes stepped through the front door of her dead grandmother's house. She froze in the dusty foyer, her breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. The sound came from directly above, a rhythmic scraping against wood, like fingernails dragging across a coffin lid. Agnes's pulse quickened as she stared at the water-stained ceiling, watching shadows dance across the peeling wallpaper in the dim afternoon light. "Just mice," she whispered to herself, but her voice cracked with uncertainty. The Victorian house loomed around her, its tall windows casting long rectangles of gray light across the warped hardwood floors. Dust motes swirled in the stagnant air, and the musty smell of decades-old secrets clung to every surface. Agnes had never visited this place as a child. Her mother had forbidden it, always making excuses about Grandma Evelyn being unwell and needing her space. Now, 3 days after the funeral, Agnes was the sole heir to this crumbling monument to madness. The scratching intensified, becoming more deliberate, more urgent. Agnes's skin crawled as she realized the sounds were following her movements below. When she stepped left, the scratching moved left. When she moved toward the staircase, it migrated to the area directly above the stairs. Something was tracking her from the attic. Agnes had planned to stay in a hotel, but the nearest one was 40 miles away, and her car had started making concerning noises on the drive up. The house would have to do for tonight. She'd sleep on the couch downstairs and deal with everything in the morning. As darkness fell, the scratching grew more frequent and more violent. It sounded like claws now, raking across the wooden beams with increasing desperation. Agnes turned the television volume up, but the static-filled channels offered little distraction from the cacophony above. At 11:47 p.m., the scratching stopped. The sudden silence was somehow worse than the noise. Agnes muted the TV and listened, her heart hammering against her ribs. The house groaned around her, settling into the cold night like an old man's bones. But from the attic came nothing, an oppressive, watchful quiet that made her skin crawl. Then she heard the whispers, soft at first, barely audible over the wind rattling the windows. Multiple voices, overlapping and indistinct, like a conversation heard through water. Agnes crept to the bottom of the staircase and looked up into the yawning darkness of the second floor. The whispers seemed to be coming from the ceiling above the landing, the attic access point. "Hello?" she called out, immediately regretting it. The whispers stopped instantly, as if someone had flipped a switch. Agnes stood frozen, every instinct screaming at her to run. But where could she go? Her car might not make it back to town, and she had no money for a hotel anyway. The whispers resumed, louder now, with an urgent pleading quality that raised goosebumps along her arms. Agnes could almost make out words, fragments of sentences that seemed to be directed at her. "Agnes, Agnes, help us." She ran to the couch and pulled a moth-eaten blanket over her head, but she could still hear them calling her name through the thin fabric. The voices multiplied, first 3 or 4, then dozens, then what sounded like an entire crowd of desperate souls pleading for her attention. Agnes didn't sleep that night. Morning brought no relief. If anything, the house felt more oppressive in the pale daylight, filtering through grimy windows. Agnes had managed only a few minutes of fitful dozing before the whispers started again at dawn, more insistent than before. She needed answers. Agnes found the attic access in the upstairs hallway, a wooden panel in the ceiling with a pull cord hanging down like a noose. The whispers had been coming from directly above this spot. Her hands shook as she grasped the cord and pulled. The panel dropped open with a groan, and a folding ladder extended toward the floor. Stale air wafted down, carrying with it a smell that made Agnes gag. Sweet decay mixed with something metallic and wrong. But the whispers had stopped the moment she opened the access panel, as if whatever was up there was holding its breath. Agnes climbed the ladder on trembling legs. The attic stretched before her in the dim light from her phone's flashlight, a cramped space filled with cobwebs and shadows. But what made her blood freeze weren't the expected boxes and furniture covered in dust sheets. Instead, the entire floor was covered with photographs. Thousands of them, arranged in careful rows like a cemetery of memories. Black and white portraits of children, families, elderly couples, all staring up at her with hollow eyes. Some of the photos looked decades old, their edges yellowed and curled. Others appeared more recent, their subjects wearing modern clothing and hairstyles. But they all shared one terrifying detail. Every single person in every photograph had their mouth open in a silent scream. Agnes's light swept across the macabre gallery, and she noticed something else that made her stomach clench. Hanging from the rafters above were dozens of small mirrors, each one reflecting her horrified face back at her from different angles. The mirrors swayed gently in the stagnant air, creating a disorienting kaleidoscope of terror. In the center of the attic, beneath the largest mirror, sat an old wooden chair. Leather straps hung from its arms and legs, and dark stains covered the seat. A camera on a tripod faced the chair, its lens aimed directly at where someone's face would be. Agnes understood with dawning horror that she was looking at Grandmother Evelyn's photography studio. Agnes scrambled down from the attic and spent the rest of the day in the kitchen, frantically searching through drawers and cabinets for any clues about her grandmother's activities. What she found made her wish she'd never inherited this cursed place. Hidden behind a false back in one of the kitchen drawers were dozens of newspaper clippings. Missing persons reports spanning 40 years, all from the surrounding counties. Children who vanished on their way to school. Families who disappeared during camping trips. Elderly people who left their homes one day and were never seen again. Each clipping had been carefully annotated in Evelyn's spidery handwriting. Subject acquired March 15th, 1982. Processing completed July 22nd, 1989. Essence captured successfully November 3rd, 2001. Agnes's hands shook as she read through the horrifying documentation. Her grandmother had been luring victims to this house for decades, photographing them in that chair while they died, believing she could trap their souls in the images. The mirrors were meant to multiply the effect, to capture every possible angle of their final moments. But Evelyn had made one critical error in her twisted methodology. Instead of trapping the souls in the photographs, she had bound them to the attic itself. Dozens of victims, possibly hundreds, were trapped in that cramped space above the ceiling, unable to move on, unable to rest. And now they were trying to warn Agnes about something. The whispers started again as darkness fell, more urgent than ever. Agnes could make out full sentences now, voices overlapping in their desperation to communicate. She's coming back. Don't let her finish. The final photograph. Run, Agnes, run. Agnes was packing her meager belongings when she heard the front door creak open. She froze, listening to slow, deliberate footsteps crossing the foyer below. The floorboards groaned under a heavy weight, and Agnes caught the acrid smell of chemicals drifting up from the first floor. Developer fluid and photographic fixative. "Agnes, dear," called a voice from downstairs, a voice she recognized from childhood phone calls and birthday cards. "I know you're here, sweetheart. Grandmother's home." But Grandmother Evelyn was dead. Agnes had seen the body at the funeral, had watched them lower the coffin into the ground. The footsteps began climbing the stairs with measured, inexorable progress. Each step sent vibrations through the old house, and dust rained down from the ceiling. The whispers in the attic became a panicked chorus, their voices blending into a single desperate warning. Agnes pressed herself against the bedroom wall, her phone clutched in her sweaty palm. No signal. Of course there was no signal in this godforsaken place. "I've been watching you, dear," Evelyn's voice called out from the hallway. "Learning about you. You have such beautiful fear in your eyes. It will photograph wonderfully. The final piece of my collection." The bedroom door handle turned slowly. Agnes dove for the window, but the frame was painted shut and wouldn't budge. Behind her, the door swung open with a prolonged creak. She turned to face whatever was wearing her grandmother's voice. The thing in the doorway retained Evelyn's general shape, but the details were all wrong. Her skin had the waxy yellow pallor of a 3-day-old corpse, and her eyes were milky white with cataracts. Chemical burns covered her hands and forearms, and her clothes reeked of grave dirt and photographic chemicals. "Come now, Agnes," the thing said, its voice a wet whisper. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be. I have such wonderful things to show you in my studio." The creature that had once been Evelyn moved with supernatural strength, dragging Agnes up the ladder into the attic despite her struggles. The whispers of the trapped souls rose to a deafening crescendo, their warnings and pleas echoing off the low ceiling. Agnes found herself strapped to the wooden chair, facing the ancient camera. The creature adjusted the lens with practiced precision, its movements deliberate and professional despite its decomposed state. "You see, dear," it explained in that horrible, wet voice, "death is just another state of being. I've learned to move between worlds, to continue my work even after my body failed. But I need one more photograph to complete my masterpiece, the fear of my own blood relative." The mirrors hanging from the rafters began to spin slowly, catching and reflecting the dim light in dizzying patterns. Agnes could see herself from dozens of angles, her wide, terrified eyes, her mouth open in a scream that seemed to go on forever. "The others tried to warn you," the creature continued, gesturing at the photographs covering the floor. "But they don't understand art. They don't appreciate the beauty of captured terror. You will, though. In a moment, you'll understand everything." The creature's finger hovered over the camera's shutter release, but Agnes had been listening to the whispers more carefully than the creature realized. Among the chaos of voices, she had heard clear instructions, a plan formed by dozens of trapped souls working together for the first time in decades. "Wait," Agnes gasped, her voice hoarse from screaming. "The photographs on the floor. They're not arranged randomly, are they?" The creature paused, tilting its decomposed head with curiosity. "You're smarter than the others," it admitted. "Yes, each photograph is positioned precisely where that person died. Their essence, their final moment, bound to the exact spot of their passing." Agnes managed a weak smile despite her terror. "Then you've made a terrible mistake, Grandmother." The creature's milky eyes widened as it realized what Agnes meant. Every photograph on the attic floor represented a soul bound to that specific location. Dozens of victims, all trapped in the same confined space, all sharing the same burning desire for revenge. And Agnes had just given them permission to act. The temperature in the attic plummeted. Frost formed on the mirrors, and Agnes's breath came out in visible puffs. The photographs on the floor began to flutter and move, as if blown by an invisible wind. But it wasn't wind. It was the combined will of every soul Evelyn had murdered, finally working together toward a single purpose. The creature spun around in confusion as the photographs rose into the air, swirling around the cramped space like a tornado of memories and pain. Each image began to glow with a cold, blue light, and the faces in the photographs were no longer screaming. They were smiling. "No," the creature hissed, backing toward the ladder. "They're bound to me. They can't..." But they could. The whispers became a roar of righteous fury as the trapped souls channeled their collective energy. The mirrors crashed down from the rafters, their fragments slicing through the creature's decomposed flesh. Photographic chemicals began seeping up through the floorboards, the sharp smell burning Agnes's nostrils. The creature stumbled backward, its form beginning to blur and distort as the souls it had enslaved turned their binding energy inward. Where Evelyn's photographs had once trapped their essences, now they trapped hers, pulling her consciousness into the same liminal space where they had suffered for decades. "You'll stay here," Agnes whispered, understanding flooding through her as the souls shared their knowledge. Trapped with them forever. The creature's scream cut off abruptly as its form dissolved entirely, leaving only a faint outline burned into the wooden floor. The photographs settled gently back to their positions, but the faces in them had changed. They looked peaceful now, no longer screaming, but simply watching. Agnes fumbled with the leather straps, her fingers numb from cold and terror. One by one, the bonds fell away, and she stumbled toward the ladder. Agnes made it to the ground floor before she realized something was wrong. The house felt different, not just empty, but fundamentally altered. The whispers had stopped completely, leaving behind a silence so profound it hurt her ears. She stumbled outside into the pre-dawn darkness, gasping the cold air and feeling like she was breathing for the first time in days. Her car started on the first try, as if the malevolent influence that had been interfering with everything mechanical had finally lifted. But as Agnes drove away from the Victorian house, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was forgetting something important. Something the souls had tried to tell her in those final moments before they found their peace. It wasn't until she was halfway to town that she remembered the last thing she had seen in the attic. A fresh photograph lying beside the chair, still wet from the developer. A photograph of her own face, mouth open in a silent scream, eyes wide with the kind of terror that only comes from seeing your own death approaching. Agnes pulled over and checked her reflection in the rearview mirror. Her face looked normal, frightened and exhausted, but normal. She touched her cheeks, felt her pulse, took deep breaths. Everything seemed fine, but photographs don't lie. As she sat in her idling car on the empty highway, Agnes began to understand the true horror of what her grandmother had created. The souls weren't just trapped by the photographs, they were replaced by them. The real people had died in that chair decades ago, and what had been walking around since then were just photographic echoes, convincing illusions with all the memories and personality of the originals. Agnes looked down at her hands and noticed they were slightly translucent in the dashboard light. When she breathed on the window, no fog appeared on the glass. The creature wearing her grandmother's face hadn't been trying to take one final photograph. It had already taken it. Agnes, the real Agnes, had died the moment she sat in that chair. What was driving away from the house now was just another echo, another trapped soul given temporary form by Evelyn's twisted art. She had maybe hours, perhaps days, before she faded completely and joined the others in their eternal prison. She thought about turning around, going back to the house, trying to find some way to reverse what had been done. But she knew it was hopeless. The souls in the attic had found their peace by destroying Evelyn, but they couldn't undo what she had created. Instead, Agnes drove toward town, determined to use whatever time she had left to warn others, to make sure no one else would ever inherit that cursed house and its terrible legacy. She would write letters, make phone calls, contact the authorities, do everything in her power to ensure the Victorian house was torn down and its secrets buried forever. But even as she made these plans, Agnes could feel herself becoming lighter, more insubstantial with each passing mile. The photograph in the attic was fading as the chemicals dried, and so was she. By the time she reached the outskirts of town, Agnes could see through her own hands to the steering wheel beneath them. By the time she pulled into the police station parking lot, her voice had become barely a whisper. And by the time the sun rose over the small mountain town, there was no trace of Agnes left at all. Just an empty car with the engine still running and a note on the passenger seat written in handwriting that grew fainter with each word. The house on Lantern Pike Street. Burn it down. Don't let anyone else inherit the shadows. The note crumbled to dust before anyone found it, and the car was eventually towed to the impound lot as abandoned property. The Victorian house still stands empty on its hill, waiting for the next unsuspecting relative to claim their inheritance. And sometimes on quiet nights when the wind is still, people in town swear they can hear whispers coming from the direction of Lantern Pike Street. Dozens of voices calling out warnings that no one is left alive to heed. The shadows in the attic have new company now, and they're still whispering. But there's no one left to listen.